Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel.
Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can do a critique of the Dr. Phil show and, of course, the accompanying YouTube channel. So the Dr. Phil show, of course, is hosted by Phil McGraw. I think it's important to point out from the beginning here that I've never been a fan of Phil McGraw, but I'm still going to do my best effort to be fair. And of course, Phil McGraw is a real person, so whenever that happens, I always say I'm not diagnosing Phil McGraw or anybody involved in this video, but rather just speculating on what could be happening in a situation like what we see here. So I used a number of sources to help me make this video. I'll put the references to those sources in the description for this video. So I'm going to start with a quick timeline in terms of Phil McGraw. We see that many years ago he was a psychotherapist, more specifically a psychologist. And he evidently did this for several years, and in 1988 he had some difficulties, and I'll talk about those in a moment. In 1990 he moved to trial consulting, and because of that work, because of the trial consulting, he met Oprah Winfrey, and he started making appearances on her show, and then he started his own show, and now of course he owns that show. And in 2017, he earned $79 million. So just to put that in perspective, the average mental health clinician earns about $46,000 a year. So Phil McGraw in 2017 made as much as 1,700 mental health clinicians. So now to move back to what happened in 1988 and kind of answer the next question, or one of the questions in here, which is Phil McGraw really a doctor? So yes, he has a PhD in psychology, so he is technically a doctor. He is not licensed to practice, and this is a bit of a long story. In Texas, in 1988, a complaint was filed against him. He had a license in psychology at that time. And in the findings of fact, right, as that board met and went through what they could prove, they found that from 1984 to 1985, he established a professional relationship, a therapeutic relationship, with a woman named Sarah Morrison, and that relationship was followed closely by a business relationship. Specifically, he hired her to work part-time. Now, it doesn't really say how closely, which I find kind of interesting, but closely, that's what was indicated. So because of this behavior, because this indicates a dual relationship, they issued a letter of reprimand, and he was supervised for a year as part of that, and was allowed to keep his license. He never actually lost his license. There was a letter of reprimand and then the supervision for a year. Now what's interesting is a lot of people criticize Phil McGraw because of this 1988 incident. But if you really look at it, I don't think this is the smoking gun. Like if somebody's looking to criticize Phil McGraw, I will definitely offer some, I think, more compelling criticisms a little later in this video. But I don't think this is the smoking gun. Yes, he was wrong to form this dual relationship. Yes, it wasn't smart. There have been others that suggested there was more to it, but there's no evidence to support that. So a letter of reprimand by itself really isn't that serious. It's really more embarrassing than anything else. So does it speak to judgment? Yes. But again, he kept his license, and he kept this license until 2006. And it's not perfectly clear what happened at that point. It seems like he gave it up, which is kind of interesting. So he held it for around 16 years longer than he needed to, because he went into trial consulting again in 1990. So it's a little mysterious why he would just give up his license in 2006. But that appears to be what happened. So what does Phil McGraw do? Well, as I mentioned, he owns the Dr. Phil show, which is a popular daytime television show, and of course operates a YouTube channel that contains clips from the show and some other things. And he's kind of a sensationalist, an entertainer. He attracts guests to the show and then exposes details of their behavior, thoughts, feelings, and relationships. And this includes individuals who are minors. The show sometimes addresses specific mental disorders like depression or schizophrenia and disorders like that. That's about 50% of the episodes. And around 17% of the episodes specifically reference psychotherapy, which again, Phil McGraw is not licensed to practice that. And then about 8% of the episodes provide on-air advice. So that gets into a little bit of a gray area. Is that therapy? Is it not therapy? So the idea here is that he is helping people, but he's not acting as a mental health clinician. So the question becomes, how is he helping them? Well, I guess, again, the advice would be one area, and another area would be that he connects them to providers who are licensed as part of what he does in the show. I've seen that quite a few times. So we've seen an interview that Phil McGraw did a while ago that he said that what he does is a different context as compared with mental health treatment, and that people, meaning his guests, are teaching tools, and that the people at home, their situation isn't the same, but if they look at the person on the screen, if they look at the guest, that might stimulate thinking. So that's kind of the idea that he's putting out there in terms of how he's doing good. He also indicated something else interesting in that same interview. The interviewer asked him if he were in private practice, would he recommend that a client be involved with a show like his? And he said he would absolutely recommend a client go on his show. So could this speak to a lack of judgment? I mean, that certainly doesn't seem like a good idea. I would never recommend to a client that they go on the Dr. Phil show. I mean, I can't imagine a circumstance where that would be a good idea. There might be some situation I don't know about where it could be, but I just can't think of any right now. You know, maybe something where if he was offering to pay for some really amazing therapy that they couldn't afford otherwise, I'd have to look at that trade-off for a client, but his position on this is really completely the opposite of mine. So now I'm going to go through some of the positives and negatives here. I'm going to cover the positives first. And again, I'm going to make my best effort to be fair. So looking at the positives of Phil McGraw, specifically of the Dr. Phil show, just to be clear, he does encourage personal responsibility. And some people criticize him on this point, that he doesn't include like systems theory, like how families and external events influence people, and the over-focuses on personal responsibility. But I actually like this part. I actually like this particular component of how he handles situations on the show. Again, emphasizing personal responsibility in general I think is positive. Another positive would be he does tend to raise awareness. There's an article that was published in 2016. It'll also be in the description, the reference for it. So we see in this article that it could be that people watch the Dr. Phil show and therefore they seek treatment. So there's some indication that he is raising awareness and helping people. Interestingly, though, a limitation of this article is that people could also be interested in seeking treatment and then watching a show. So it was correlational and not causational, but still, it's an article that I think was generally supportive of his show. Another positive is it's pretty clear that Phil McGraw is intelligent, and he seems to have fairly good social skills, although he doesn't always use them on the show, and I'll talk about that in the negatives. But either way, he seems like a bright man. I don't think there's any escaping this. When I've watched some of the episodes, some of the things he comes up with are actually quite insightful. Another positive is that many of the videos, the shows, are actually quite good. I don't have any real complaints about most of them. So to his credit, most of the episodes are actually fairly good, or at least not bad. Another element, and I'm going to list this as a positive, but it could be considered a positive or negative, is that his message is really designed for a wide audience. And I think this explains why there's kind of a lack of science in the episodes. He doesn't really refer to scientific literature that often. Mostly it seems like it's his opinion. But again, he's trying to reach a wide audience, and under his vision, that's really the theory, right? He has the guest on there, and this stimulates thinking in the audience. So he wants to reach a wide audience with that type of design. Phil McGraw is active in donating money to charities, so I think that is important to mention as a positive. And another positive, and this is really the California Board of Psychology that came up with this and not me, is that they determined that he does not need a license for the purposes of his show, because he's doing more entertainment than psychology. So the show is in California, so of course, with Phil McGraw having been a psychologist in the past, the California Board of Psychology would kind of take a look at that. And again, in 2002 they did, and they seem to think it's okay. I'm not sure I agree, but I wanted to list that as a positive because, I mean, it's a board that in theory would know what they're doing in that area, and that's the determination they came to. So now on to the negatives about the Dr. Phil show. So one of the things that really bothers me, and there's actually a few here of things that bother me about the show, is that Phil McGraw puts himself as always smarter, always correct. He has the audience on his side, which is I mean, that's kind of obvious that would be happening. People come there because they like him, they're going to be on his side. And I think what happens is he kind of bullies the guest around. I've seen the guest make really good points on his show, and he just dismisses them with his so-called expert power. But interestingly, he treats mental health professionals with a great deal of respect, maybe even sometimes too much respect. But the people with mental disorders, that's not what's happening with them. That's not how he treats them. Now, he also tends to ask many questions without really stopping. I remember this one episode where he's questioning a daughter about an accusation she made against her mother, and he asked like 10 questions without giving her an opportunity to answer. It appears, though, she had a pretty good memory because she did answer many of the questions in her narrative, but I think he needs to just kind of focus his thoughts a little bit and ask one question at a time and not stack on a lot of questions at once. Another negative here is he says he's not acting as a therapist, but he's always identifying problems, which is something that a therapist would do. And it's not just the problem that somebody says they have. Like if somebody says that they're sad and that's their problem, or they're anxious and that's their problem, and he accepts it, well, that's one thing. But he's always coming up with this line. He says, the real problem is. So he'll say, the real problem is you don't trust people. The real problem is you don't take responsibility. He's defining the problem for the guest, which seems a lot more like therapy as opposed to an entertainment show. I also see this theme of him making fun of people, and this is, again, not in most episodes, but he seems to do this as part of kind of his MO on the show. For example, there was one guest a while back that appeared delusional. I'm not going to diagnose her, of course, but she appeared to have symptoms that were consistent with delusions. She believed that terrorists were conspiring against her and hurting her with gases or something like that. And Phil McGraw just kept coming at her, saying, you're wrong, it doesn't make sense, and directly challenging her, which, of course, if she did have delusions, that would not be a good strategy. Really, I think he was just trying to embarrass her. At least that's what it seems like. Another example would be there was a young lady who thought that she was the best dancer in the world. Clearly, if you look at her dancing, she was not. And he just directly confronted her, again, with the purpose of embarrassment. What he did really didn't seem helpful. It just seemed destructive. So embarrassing the guest seems to be, again, kind of a theme. We also see that a lot of the techniques he uses on the show, they sure look like counseling techniques or therapeutic techniques. So, for example, one time he was working with a mother and a daughter, and he told them to look into each other's eyes and honestly talk about their feelings. That sure seems like a therapeutic technique. We also see instances of poor judgment. He went to see Britney Spears when she was in the hospital and then made a public statement about that visit later on. That seems like terrible judgment. And he also had a reality star on a show one time named Todd Herzog, who was clearly intoxicated. Now, there's this allegation that they made vodka available to him. I don't know if that's true or not. And these may be isolated incidents, Britney Spears and Todd Herzog. But either way, they do seem to indicate poor judgment. He's also asked some of his guests with mental disorders, and some without, to incriminate themselves. And he says things like, don't worry about the consequences. Now, this one I have to explain a little bit, because some might say, why not? Is it a big deal? If they're criminals and they confess, isn't that what we want? But I think that in order to really understand this, you have to appreciate being a mental health clinician and how we work with people. We see that there are many failings in the criminal justice system, and sometimes people with mental disorders are taken advantage of by the police and prosecutors. They're not treated fairly. So I'm not supporting criminal acts. I want criminals to be held responsible. But a lot of individuals with mental disorders, or at least some of them, don't know their rights. They get scared by the police. And I believe that people are entitled to a vigorous defense. So the best advice for somebody in that situation would be go talk to an attorney. If the attorney advises them to then go on the Dr. Phil show and confess, well, okay, at least they had the advice of an attorney. I'd be surprised if an attorney would recommend that. But again, I believe in a vigorous defense, and I think the rights of individuals should be protected. I think that Phil McGraw trying to get people to incriminate themselves really shows how disconnected he is from the challenges faced by people with mental disorders. On another episode, he says that it's a high standard to take away somebody's liberty. So if he really believes that, why ask people to confess? So this point kind of leads me to discussing ethical principles. Now, I realize that Phil McGraw says he's not acting as a therapist, but I want to apply the ethical principles of counseling to what he does, just because I think it's interesting and it points out some kind of key features of his behavior. The first ethical principle is autonomy, and this connects back to asking guests to confess. Autonomy is the principle that addresses independence. So clients have the freedom to make their own choices and decide their own actions according to their own values. So how is asking a client to confess, or a guest to confess, consistent with autonomy? What about non-malfeasance? That's the second principle. It's the concept of doing no harm. Was that concept being used with Britney Spears and Todd Herzog? And the same thing with beneficence. This is doing good, looking out for the welfare of a client, right? Same situation. The fourth principle is justice. So the first three we have autonomy, non-malfeasance, and beneficence. The fourth is justice. And it means treating all individuals the same. Is that what's happening with Phil McGraw when he is respectful of professionals but disrespectful of non-professionals? And then the last principle is fidelity. This is being loyal and faithful and honoring commitments. It's not really clear how this one fits in, but I just wanted to mention it is the fifth core principle in ethics. So with all these different points in mind, both the positive and the negative, my question would be, why would anyone believe that Phil McGraw knows something special clinically? He hasn't practiced since 1990. Now, he had his license until 2006, so even if he did know something, how is he going to apply it in that forum? Again, his show is not designed to deliver therapeutic services. So if Phil McGraw says it's not therapy, and he's not practicing in any way, what is it? Kind of back to my original point, it's really just entertainment. And I think when kind of weighing everything, not even really good entertainment. So mental health clinicians, those with licenses, those that practice and really do the work of counseling and psychology and social work, they have a deep respect for people who suffer from mental disorders. Some who suffer from mental disorders are among the most vulnerable in our society, and they deserve our protection and our care. They deserve more than the Dr. Phil show. So one last point I'll make here is in the interview I mentioned before with ABC, where Phil McGraw was talking about how he's trying to stimulate the thinking of the public. He was asked, what about people who say he's doing more harm than good? And his advice was, pick up your remote and move on. That's actually what he said. And on this point, I concur. So I know whenever I talk about topics like the Dr. Phil show, or Phil McGraw, or protecting the public, and other topics like this, there's going to be people that agree and disagree with me. Please put your opinions in the comments section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this critique of the Dr. Phil show to be interesting. Thanks for watching.